I'm calling this the Marxist BLM versus the Black Lives Matter concept. And the BLM is the Black Lives Matter group that exists in America, that is leading these protests around the country. And I want to start with something. Before I get to BLM, I wanted to ask Matt the Wonderful to play something. I think this was clip 2, but I've lost track of the numbers, Matt. But it's the one with Edward Griffin. This is a guy who's doing commentary. You can see from the black and white film set and just the whole way it looks that this is several decades old. But this is this journalist, Edward Griffin, speaking about what he discovered in diving into to understand the Communist Party in America in the 1920s. And here he is, Edward Griffin.
As early as 1928, the communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric. By constantly probing and straining at this one spot, they calculated that eventually the cloth could be torn apart.
Okay, so this was just a fabulous thing, and what he's getting at, this idea is getting at here is the communists themselves in the 1920s in America. Actually, Matt, is that the whole clip? Matt?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, because I didn't send him that. I cut off a portion I wanted to have him play. But anyway, I'll just tell you the rest of it. So this Griffin guy dug in 1920s what the Communist Party actually was saying was the idea that you can divide America. And he talked about, I'm so sorry, I cut off too much of that clip, but he talked about how the communists decided you need to infiltrate the black community, you need to infiltrate the white community, you need to endlessly attempt to foment division. You have to try to foment division, and the way to do that is to use race. The Communist Party recognizes in America as early as 1920, we can use the racial issue to divide America. He also talked about a book that was written, and this is the one part I was really hoping we would get to. We didn't, I guess I cut off that clip, unfortunately. But there was a book written by a guy who was talking about the idea that he had a black man, he had joined the Communist Party because he thought the communists were there to save his people, to help the blacks in America. And he became very, very immersed in the Communist Party. He within America, rose in the ranks. This is a black American guy, and who realized that the actual, the party, the Communist Party he was heavily immersed in, was just using him to get to the absolute communist takeover of our country, the destruction of all that is good about America, the destruction of the freedom of America, the destruction of free markets. The Communist Party was using race as an issue. And so thankfully, this guy realized this, and this was supposed to be in this clip, but this black American wrote this book, and now it's going to bug the daylights. I'll bring it for you tomorrow, but it was like class communism, and anyway, it's so disappointing because I thought I had this clip. But anyway, it was a black man who wrote this book, and that's this Griffin guy went on to talk about the idea that the book was written by this guy who spent the rest of his life, he withdrew from the Communist Party, and he went around the country talking about to his fellow black Americans, do not buy into communism. They're just using you. Now, for many decades, most Americans knew that communism was unacceptable, inconsistent with the idea of America, was simply not going to be, was just going to ruin our whole country, ruin our prosperity, ruin our freedom, ruin our opportunity. But we're back now, here we are in 2020, and we have still that same communist, Marxist, leftist element at work inside what we now know as Black Lives Matter. And the next clip is for Matt to show you, to play for you. There is a woman who was one of the Black Lives Matter founders, and she talks about in her life why she came around to what she recognized, what motivated her to form Black Lives Matter.
After the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin, 3 black women, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and our guest this segment, Patrisse Cullors, formed what has since become the global phenomenon of Black Lives Matter. So Patrisse, for those who may have just been introduced to you in a most direct way at the Netroots conference intervention you conducted, Please help them and us see past what appears, from my point of view, to have been a tremendous amount of appropriation and suppression of you, Opal and Alicia, as founders, and the particular brand of radical Black gender and sexuality politics you all work with. So if you would, please summarize for us how you see the origins, politics, and purpose of Black Lives Matter. As you are advanced in your own organization, as you all are headed to Cleveland to participate in this Black Lives Movement conference, how do you respond to that particular critique? Again, a loving critique from an elder of the struggle that some others share, that I've even shared as well, to be frank, as a concern about, in part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
Okay, trained Marxist. And I just want to say, I want to make this really clear what I'm trying to get at today, because it's bigger than just, bigger than just in the last month or so, we've had a lot of violence out of the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa, and they have locked arms, locked elbows together in this enormous disruption we're watching. But they're going back to what the communists had to say in 1920s, going back to the recognition that the communists could divide America by race, by using race as a wedge issue to turn Americans against each other, to make them become suspicious of each other. This is what, this idea of the communists using it is what we're seeing being played out today in the radicalness of the Black Lives Matter organization. That woman, just one of them, there's two of the three founders are similar, she says, Marxist in their mindset. And I want to dig in this idea of Marxism. It's not, they're not saying in the Black Lives Matter movement, they're obviously not standing up and saying, we want to have the government ownership of all materials, government ownership of all, means of production, and we want the communists to take over America. They're smart enough not to say that. They're smart enough to not say that. What they are saying, though, is because of what they are portraying as a massively racist country, with just racism bursting out all over the place in this country, they are saying that in order to remedy that, every change they want must be made. Everybody in America must salute to the agenda of the BLM organization, because they are speaking up against repression, and so therefore every change they demand, everyone must agree with. And so America, when I told you at the start of the show, I had this thought about just America slipping away. We have so much of America surrendering to the radical demands of these radical leftists because race is being used as an issue, and nobody in this planet Earth wants to be called a racist. Nobody wants to have that suspicion cast on them. No one wants that label on them. So organization after organization, governmental organizations, local town councils, businesses, everyone seems to be surrendering to the BLM Marxist agenda. And when I say Marxist agenda, I want to run through some examples of that. For example, we had in a show last week, Brandon Tatum, talking about former police officer from Phoenix, former Democrat, who founded the Blexit movement, co-founded it along with Candace Owens. He's talking about, 99% of police officers in America are not racist. They don't think about race. They don't function. They just do their job. But we're supposed to all agree in this country that there is a radical problem with racism in the police departments in this country, institutional racism, and that is just pervasive. Criminal justice system has institutional racism baked into it. So all of this is being drawn, that picture is being drawn for the American people, and the question being posed to everyone is, Will you take the side of Black Lives Matter, or are you a racist? Will you sign on to the Marxist BLM agenda, or are you a racist? And too many people are just going, I'll surrender, I'll surrender. I'm going to give you some examples. You remember we talked about the shooting in Atlanta, the police-involved shooting in the Wendy's parking lot in Atlanta. Rayshard Brooks killed by a black man killed by a white Atlanta police officer. That was one example. Brandon Tatum walked us through it. Numerous other police authorities have walked the American people through it and said that officer had no choice. When you have a man turning and aiming your, even though it wasn't a gun, it wasn't a firearm, it was a taser. Once you're going to let a man who's been strong enough to overpower two police officers and who's going to shoot the taser at you, you don't have to let him do that. You don't know what you're going to do. So back to that point. So that whole shooting happened. There's been criminal charges filed, unjustified in the view of many, many people. But in Atlanta, after this Rayshard Brooks shooting, the police officers arrested, charged with murder in record time. I mean, just barely time to even review the facts. And the DA couldn't just spew out the murder charges fast enough. But his stepmother, the police officer involved in that shooting, his stepmother, who happens to work in HR in some company in Atlanta, was fired. Fired by a company. The woman who's the stepmother of the police officer, fired by a company because they said, other people in our workforce are no longer comfortable working around you. Other people aren't really comfortable working near you anymore. So, we got to let you go. So you have businesses capitulating on all sorts of pressure, whatever BLM says we're going to do, whatever the Marxists say we're going to do. So you have that instance. You have a professor at UCLA under suspension because he declined the request of black students at UCLA to get to waive all final exams due to racial injustice and due to the riots in this country. And he said, no, we're having final exams. Everybody else has an exam, you get an exam. And that professor is now in trouble with UCLA. Another example, this article, in fact, I think we put up on our website, in America, in some public school in America, a public school, held a workshop for elementary age kids to explain to them that the police are racist. So what are you supposed to do when you're the parent in that school? You're supposed to say, well, I guess we're just going to have to give in and everyone agrees police are racist because you can't argue, you can't speak up. This Marxism idea I'm getting at people, and I have one more story I want to get to today, but I'm going to have to wrap this up for today. But I want to get at this idea, we're going to explore it more and more. Marxism, the economic theory, this whole concept of owning means of production, that's one thing. But the concept of Marxism is a much bigger thought. People use cultural Marxism as one expression, political Marxism, legal Marxism. It is the entire uprooting of the concept of America, the idea of the freedom of the individual, of the rule of law in this country, of the rule of law that applies to everyone equally, that we have a government that lives, that's entire purpose is to protect the governed, protect the people, that the government has power because of the consent of the governed. All of those foundational ideas of America are under assault from the radical left, under assault from Marxism. BLM is just one avenue to do it. Antifa is another avenue to do it. The people trying to silence anyone who dares speak up are silenced. This Marxism idea, which is just astonishingly taken hold in our country, is the idea that whatever the leftists want the country to think on any issue, wherever the leftists are pushing, what they want you to see truth is what you must see as true. And you may not speak up, you may not counter, you may not even have the right to have the debate, because the Marxists who've now taken over the Democrat Party and BLM and Antifa are all banding together to silence and crush the idea of America. And this is why I say at the start of the show today, I said I feel like the America of the founding, the freedom of America is slipping away, because we've barely found any strength in our country yet to stand up against the Marxists who are literally burning our cities, who've taken over. We talked about that several times recently in Seattle, the Chaz area, where they still don't have the local authorities willing to be the grown-ups in the room and insist we actually have a country and a state and cities and police and a rule of law, and it applies to everyone. The Marxists are winning on the left. And this is a really important concept. It's not just that the Marxists are winning in Seattle. The Marxists are winning in the conversation in our country, in the American political conversation. The Marxists are winning the argument that they will dictate what must be said. They have decided all police are racist, even though that is preposterous. In fact, in Atlanta, it's something near half of the officers are black in Atlanta. And yet, in Atlanta, one example recently, which appears to be the justified shooting, unfortunate but justified shooting of Rayshard Brooks, is now another one of the litany of names they add to the list to point out that police are racist, and no one's allowed to counter that. Parents have to tolerate their kids being taught that in public school. Professors cannot impose the same rules on everyone. Say, yeah, actually, we're going to have exams on schedule, because that's what we do in our country. We have exams. Everyone knows exam season's coming, but you're not allowed to do that. I mean, now the UCLA professor is being questioned for saying that he does not think that that they ought to have an extension or abandon exams in response to the racial unrest. I mean, I have story after story after story, but the idea that a business will stand up and say, yeah, we're not going to permit, we're not going to have this woman, this stepmother, she can't even work here anymore because her son was arrested and charged in a shooting for which the stepmother clearly had nothing to do with it. I'm getting at the idea, and I want you to keep on thinking about it, and we're going to keep on talking about it. We can't surrender. We can't surrender the rationality of Western civilization, the rightness of political conversation, the idea of America, the rule of law in America, the idea that we are going to have a rule of law that applies to everyone. We cannot surrender that because the Marxist movement in this country has grown so strong. I don't even think they're very big, to be clear. I'm not saying that half the country is Marxist. I'm saying whatever you want to call, term you want to use, socialist, Marxist, collectivist, leftist, communist, whatever term it is really not a huge portion of our country. But it is a vocal, it is a radical, it is a bullying, it is a mindset that's taken hold that says we're going to get everything we want. You're going to do exactly what we say, and everyone's going to shut down. And so back to my mention earlier about the Uncle Tom movie. The people in that movie have put up with the bullying of the leftists in this country for decades. Not just Larry Elder, but Lieutenant Colonel Alan West and Herman Cain. And literally there were a dozen or more stellar people in that movie, all talking about how much they've had to put up with, how much grief from their families, their friends, Hollywood, journalism, everywhere for saying, I am black, I am conservative, I'm Republican. If they can stand up to that pressure and make that film at this time, America can learn something from them. We have to be the ones standing up. We have to be the ones saying, we're not going to let the radical bullying left steamroll freedom in America, which is exactly the path they are on.